In his State of the Union address last week, President Obama proposed taking $30 billion of TARP funds, giving it to community banks, and having them lend it to small and medium-sized businesses as a way to reinvigorate the economy and jobs growth. A plan that sounds a lot like the plan our guest today, Lynn Tilton, CEO of Patriot Partners, has been talking about for over a year, nearly a year and a half now. So, Lynn, when you heard the president say that, what was your response?
Well, I guess if imitation is the greatest form of flattery, I'm taking a shower in flattery.
Is it going to work? Is this? It sounds like it's the essence of your plan, but is it your actual plan?
No, there's actually one major piece that's been changed for politically correct or ideologically compliant issues, which is to give money to the banks rather than the private sector. And that'll be exactly the reason it'll fail. I mean, when I spoke to the Senate Banking Committee, when I was at Treasury, and they brought up giving to the banks, I was very clear that banks will not make these kind of rescue loans that need to be made. I mean, we need to remember that most of these small and mid-sized businesses haven't seen working capital in 18 to 24 months. At this point, yes, they are deteriorated credits. If none of us had paychecks for the last 24 months, we'd be deteriorating credits. So these are high-risk loans that have to be made on a high-reward basis. So even though nobody wants to give to Wall Street, this has to be private sector money that's actually their equity capital, first loss layer, and then levered up with TARP money. But it has to be rescue lending to companies that will otherwise cease to be.
So you're saying essentially that if $30 billion is given to the community banks, they're going to do the same thing that the big banks have done with TARP money so far? They're just going to sit on it?
The same shocker that banks house bankers who actually will behave as bankers will be repeated again. Or, look, most of the small community banks have their own issues now. I mean, we're seeing failures every weekend. They're sitting on large commercial real estate portfolios. They've got regulators inside. They don't have the time, the energy, or the ability with people to make these kind of high-risk loans right now. The only people that can make these loans are investors who are in this business that will have their own skin in their game and have the firm of people to do this kind of lending. So the feeling is if you're giving it to small community banks who didn't do what the large banks and investment banks did, it can be embraced. The problem is it won't work to accomplish the goal, which is job creation in America.
So you heard President Obama the other night, $100 billion for new jobs. Will that work?
In the end, the things that he's talking about, to me, do not get to the core of the issue. I mean, when you're offering tax credit for new employment, you have to have the business to be able to pay someone. So if I get $5,000, but I got to pay someone $50,000, and I don't have the business to support it, it really doesn't spur the growth. That only works if you're holding back on hiring people, but you really need people, and it's incentive. The issue here is we're not really seeing revenue growth in this country. I mean, as there are 30 million Americans unemployed, $12 trillion of household wealth loss. Consumers are not out there spending because they either don't have a job or they're worried about having a job. So the things that will create jobs in this country is actually making changes that allow us to compete in this country in terms of being the makers of things.
Talk more about that, because President Obama also last week said he had a goal that we should double our exports in 5 years. He wants there to be manufacturing in this country. Is that a realistic goal?
Look, I have no clue how that can be accomplished. I mean, I'd love to get into that conversation and debate. I mean, people think with a weaker dollar that allows us to export more things, but you have to make things in this country to actually export things. And how weak do we let a dollar get just so that we can be the cheapest labor in the world, so that we actually can compete on manufacturing? I say if you really want to create jobs in this country, you have to make difficult decisions. Number one, start with the Department of Defense, the biggest spender in this country, buying American. We should be buying American regardless of other people's products unless we cannot get a competitive product
I'm just curious,
in this country.
I've heard you say this before. What are we buying? What is the Defense Department buying that isn't made in America?
Well, this will look self-serving because I manufacture helicopters, but the light utility helicopter contract went to Eurocopter last year or 2 years ago, $13 billion. First 95 helicopters were built in France. They were supposed to be built in Mississippi. Okay? There's plenty if you go through. There's a Barry Amendment that means clothing needs to be manufactured for the military, but there are lots of products that the military is buying, all of it, that are built overseas. That would actually make companies more competitive, create jobs. I mean, you have to look at where government's spending and not spending here. The other thing is there are tariffs in every other country in the world when people ship goods from one country to the next. Most of those tariffs don't exist here. And so we can't compete. Everybody talks about labor. Well, we can't compete on labor. We have manufacturing where labor may be only 20% of the total cost, and yet we can't compete. I mean, the textile industry, the manufacture of textile garments, cotton's 70% of your costs. Why is it that we don't have any textiles in this companies in this country unless Wilbur Ross or I own them? It's not because of labor. It's actually because cotton is subsidized in other countries, and with NAFTA and CAFTA, there are all ways to get around to get cheaper goods into this country. So since I don't have to run for public office, or I don't have to be reelected, I can actually speak to unpopular issues. But in the end, that's the only thing that's going to create jobs in America. I think if you ask people on the street today, would they rather pay 10% more for all their goods going forward, but know they have job security for the next 20 years, provided they're hardworking and appreciative and come to work each day, they'd take that job. And that's the choice that ultimately has to be made. We who have our job love the cheapest American good. We who don't have that job want a job. Ultimately, that tough choice needs to be made. I know, all my life I would have paid a little more for goods and had fewer goods in order to know that I'd be able to raise my daughter and feed her.
Thanks very much.